You walk 10,000 steps on the counter, or a loop around the block after dinner, or 40 minutes on the treadmill before the house wakes up, and you count that walk as the one thing you never skip. You are right to count it. Walking protects your joints, your blood pressure, your mood, and your brain, but silently. During the 90 minutes that decide where the fat from your last meal gets stored, that walk is doing almost nothing to the fat packed around your liver, your pancreas, and your intestines. Not because walking fails, because of a timing collision between when you walk and when your body makes the storage decision, and because there is a muscle in your lower leg that can do something walking physically cannot sustain. Here is the number that should stop you. In a study run by Mark Hamilton at the University of Houston, published in the journal iScience in 2022, participants who used one specific low-effort contraction while seated at a desk showed a 52% smaller blood sugar rise after a glucose drink and needed about 60% less insulin to handle the same load, sustained across 3 hours. They were not walking. They were not sweating. They were sitting in a chair, moving one part of one leg, and their metabolism behaved like a different person's. That is the whole video. The exact mechanism, why it beats walking specifically for the fat around your organs, and what it costs you to run it. At the end, I will give you the SOL protocol, 3 adjustments, each with an exact number that fit inside the day you already have. But if I hand you the protocol now, the numbers will look arbitrary and you will drop it by Thursday. So I'm going to walk you through the 4 hours after a meal, stage by stage, so you can watch your own body make the storage decision in real time. When you see where the decision happens, the 3 numbers stop being rules and become obvious. The invisible villain in this video has a name, and almost nobody in the mainstream explains it. Lipoprotein lipase. Most people over 50 have never heard of it, which is remarkable, because it is the enzyme that physically decides whether the fat circulating in your blood right now ends up burned inside a muscle or parked around your organs. Picture your bloodstream after a meal as a highway full of delivery trucks. The trucks are called chylomicrons and very low-density lipoproteins, and they are carrying triglycerides, the packaged fat from your meal and from your liver. Trucks cannot unload themselves. Every tissue that wants fat has to send a crew out to the curb to open the trailer. That crew is lipoprotein lipase, sitting on the inner wall of the small blood vessels that feed your muscles and your fat tissue. When the enzyme is active in a muscle, the trucks stop there and the fat gets pulled inside and burned. When the enzyme is quiet in a muscle, the trucks drive past and keep looking for somewhere to unload. Now, the part that changes how you see your own day. Hamilton spent years before the Soleus work studying what he called inactivity physiology, published across the Journal of Physiology and Diabetes, and what he documented is that the enzyme in your leg muscles does not need a hard workout to switch on. It needs contraction. Local, continuous, low-level contraction. And when that contraction stops, the enzyme activity in those muscles collapses within hours, not days. Not because you did anything wrong, because muscular silence is itself a signal. Your body reads a still leg the same way a warehouse manager reads an empty loading dock. Nobody is here to receive the shipment, so send the truck somewhere else. And somewhere else, for anyone over 45, is almost always the same address. Visceral fat is the tissue packed inside your abdominal cavity, wrapped around the organs, and it has 2 properties that make it the default destination. It keeps its unloading crew active nearly all the time, and it drains directly into the portal vein, the short highway that runs straight into your liver. So the fat that no muscle claimed does not just sit there quietly. It parks in the one depot with a private road into the organ that controls your blood sugar. And this depot is not a cosmetic problem. National survey data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention shows that more than half of American adults over the age of 40 carry a waist measurement in the range associated with elevated visceral fat, and that the share climbs with each decade after 50, even in people whose body weight has barely moved. The scale can stay flat while the storage location quietly changes underneath it because muscle is leaving and the abdominal depot is taking the delivery. This is the real biology of visceral fat, and it explains something that frustrates people who are doing everything right. You can walk 10,000 steps a day, hold your weight steady on the scale, and still watch your waist expand a little each year. Because your total daily movement can be high, while your muscular activity during the exact hours the trucks are on the road is close to zero. Weight is a total. Storage location is a schedule. So let me start the clock, because the schedule is the whole game. Minute 0. You finish eating. Nothing dramatic happens yet. Your stomach is still working, and the fat from that meal has not entered your bloodstream, because dietary fat does not take the direct route sugar takes. It gets packaged in your intestinal cells, loaded into chylomicrons, and released into the lymphatic system first, which drains into your bloodstream near your collarbone. That detour is why the fat from lunch shows up late, minute 15 to minute 30. Glucose from the meal is already crossing into your blood, and your pancreas is responding. Insulin rises. Here is the piece the mainstream conversation about insulin almost never includes. Insulin does not just move sugar. Insulin is also the single strongest activator of lipoprotein lipase in your fat tissue, and at the same time it suppresses the enzyme in your muscle tissue. Read that again. The same hormone opens the receiving dock at the fat warehouse and shuts the one at the muscle. Your body is not malfunctioning. It was built for a world where a large meal was a rare event worth storing. Minute 30. Your blood sugar is climbing toward its peak. In a person under 35 with healthy muscle mass, that peak is modest and short. After 50, three things have usually shifted at once. Muscle mass is lower, so there is less storage space for the glucose. The muscle cells are less sensitive, so more insulin is needed to move the same amount. And the pancreas holds insulin elevated longer to finish the job. So the same plate of food produces a higher and longer insulin signal than it did 20 years ago, which means the muscle dock stays closed longer and the fat dock stays open longer. This is not motivation. It is biology, and it is measurable. Minute 45. Now the trucks arrive. Triglycerides from the meal begin entering circulation and will keep rising for the next 2 to 3 hours. This is the moment the storage decision actually gets made, and I want you to notice where you are when it happens. You are at your desk. You are on the couch. You are driving home. You are doing the dishes, and then sitting down. For almost everyone watching, the 90 minutes after a meal are the most sedentary 90 minutes of the day. And they are the exact 90 minutes when your bloodstream is carrying its heaviest fat load of the day. Your morning walk happened 11 hours ago. The dog loop happens at 9 at night, long after dinner's trucks have already unloaded. The gym session on Tuesday was excellent for your heart and did essentially nothing for the Thursday lunch that is circulating right now. The mainstream advice tells you to accumulate movement. Your enzymes do not care about your accumulation. They respond to whether the leg is contracting while the trucks are on the road. Minute 60 to minute 90. Insulin is still elevated. Triglycerides are climbing, and your leg muscles are running near zero electrical activity. Sitting still is not a neutral state for muscle. It is a directional state, and the direction points toward the abdomen. And here is where the muscle in your calf becomes the most interesting tissue in your body, because it is the one part of this system that does not obey the usual rules. The soleus is the deep muscle underneath your calf. It is the muscle that holds you upright without you noticing, and it is built almost entirely from slow oxidative fibers designed to work for hours without fatigue and without competing for your blood sugar the way a workout does. Hamilton's group found that when the soleus is contracted in a specific low-effort pattern while the rest of the body sits, it raises local oxidative metabolism and keeps it raised for hours, pulling glucose and fat out of the blood at rates that a walk cannot match, because a walk ends. That is the reason the boring thing beats the walk, not intensity, duration inside the storage window. Which raises the obvious question, and it is the one I get every time I explain this to someone over 50. If the muscle is that efficient, why does it not fatigue? And why has nobody told you about it? The soleus does not fatigue the way your other muscles fatigue, and the reason comes down to what it burns and what it was built to do. Most of your skeletal muscle is a mix of fiber types. Fast fibers are powerful, They run largely on glycogen stored inside the muscle itself, and they exhaust that local supply quickly, which is why a hard set burns and why a sprint ends. The soleus is different. Anatomical studies of human calf tissue put its slow oxidative fiber content around 80 to 90%, one of the highest proportions anywhere in the body, alongside a mitochondrial density that lets it burn fuel with oxygen for hours instead of minutes. It is the muscle that keeps you standing at a counter without you thinking about it. It has been holding your skeleton against gravity your entire adult life, and it has never once asked for a rest day. Here is the property that makes it useful for the storage window specifically. Hamilton's group at the University of Houston reported that when the soleus is contracted in that particular low-effort pattern, it does not draw on its own glycogen the way conventional exercise does. It pulls fuel out of circulation, blood glucose and blood fat, taken directly from the bloodstream as they pass through, which is exactly where the problem lives after a meal. And because it never touches its internal reserve, it never hits the wall that ends a workout. They documented the contraction being sustained for hours with local oxidative metabolism staying elevated the entire time in people who reported no meaningful effort while doing it. Think about the scale of that. The soleus is roughly 1% of your body weight, 1% of your tissue working at a low, unremarkable level, moving the blood chemistry of the whole system. Because it is not competing with anything and it is not stopping. That is the piece that makes this beat the walk. And I want to be precise about the comparison, because I am not telling you that walking is inferior exercise. Walking uses far more muscle mass and burns more calories per minute. But a walk lasts 30 minutes and then ends, and afterward, you sit. The soleus contraction lasts as long as you are sitting anyway, which means it covers the full window when the delivery trucks are on the road. Peak intensity is not what determines where the fat from lunch gets parked. Coverage of the window determines it. So let me put you back on the clock, because the window is still open. Hour 1.5. Triglycerides in your blood are climbing steadily now. Insulin is still above baseline, which means the unloading crew at your fat tissue is switched on, and the crew at your muscle is switched down. If your legs are still, the trucks have exactly one realistic destination. Hour 2. This is where the blood fat curve is usually approaching its highest point after a mixed meal, and it is also the point where the difference between two people eating the same food becomes visible in the blood. Someone whose legs contracted through that window clears the fat measurably faster. Someone who sat carries a higher triglyceride level for longer, and that extended exposure is not a neutral event. It is the raw material sitting on the doorstep of the abdominal depot. Hour 3. In a metabolically flexible person, triglycerides are falling and insulin is close to baseline. After 50, that curve tends to be flatter and longer. Blood fat clearance slows with age, with lower muscle mass, and with the accumulated visceral tissue itself, which creates a loop. The depot that already exists releases free fatty acids into the portal vein. The liver responds by producing more of its own delivery trucks, and your baseline blood fat starts the next meal higher than it should. Every meal begins with the road already busy. Hour 4. The window finally closes. And then, 2 or 3 hours later, you eat again and it opens again. 3 meals a day plus an evening snack means this window is open somewhere between 8 and 12 hours of your waking life. Your 30-minute walk covers a fraction of it. Now, I want to answer the question that has probably been sitting in the back of your mind since I said the word soleus. If a single low-effort contraction can move blood sugar by half and cut insulin demand by more than half, why is this not in every guideline, every doctor's office, every fitness account you follow? The answer is not a conspiracy. It is a measurement problem that became a cultural problem, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. For the last 50 years, exercise science has measured physical activity almost entirely in metabolic equivalents, the unit called the MET. 1 MET is what you burn sitting still. The public health guidelines that shape everything downstream, including the recommendation of 150 minutes per week of moderate activity, are built on a threshold of 3 METs. Anything below 3 METs is classified as sedentary, and for research purposes, it disappears. It is not measured. It is not counted. It goes in the same bucket as sleeping. The soleus contraction is a low MET activity. By the ruler the entire field uses, it registers as nothing. So for decades, the tool that measures exercise was structurally incapable of detecting the one thing that works inside the storage window, because the thing that works does not raise whole body calorie burn much at all. It changes which tissue is doing the taking. Hamilton's own point in his published work is that local muscle metabolism and whole body energy expenditure are different variables, and the field spent 50 years measuring the second one and assuming it described the first. That single measurement choice is why your doctor has never mentioned it. It is not that they withheld anything. Almost nobody in the mainstream explains this because the mechanism sits in a blind spot the tools created. The commercial layer sits on top of that, and it is less innocent. The fitness industry cannot sell you a thing that costs nothing, requires no equipment, and happens under a desk. It sells intensity because intensity photographs well, produces sweat as visible evidence, and justifies a membership fee. The wearable industry sells step counts because steps are countable, and countability sells devices. And the number itself, the 10,000 steps you have been chasing, was never a research finding. It came from a pedometer marketed in Japan in the 1960s, whose name translated roughly as 10,000 step meter. The number was chosen because the character for 10,000 looks like a walking figure. That is the origin of the target that governs the health behavior of 100 million people. I am not saying step counts are useless. Later research has found real mortality benefits from higher daily step totals, particularly in older adults, and the benefit appears to level off closer to 7,000 or 8,000 steps than 10. But the number you organized your life around came from a product name, and the mechanism I have been describing to you came from a laboratory. And only one of those two things gets repeated every day by people who sound authoritative. Here is the part that bothers me most about the way this gets simplified for people over 50. The standard advice given to a 60-year-old with a growing waist is to move more, walk more, be more active. And the person often is active. They are already doing the walk. What they are not doing, because nobody explained the window, is putting muscular activity in the 90 minutes after eating, which is the only period where that activity changes the storage decision. So they walk more, the waist keeps growing, and they conclude that their body has stopped responding. Their body responded perfectly. The instruction was aimed at the wrong hour. I got the timing wrong myself for a long time, and in a fairly embarrassing way. A couple of years ago, I wore a continuous glucose monitor for 3 months, mostly out of curiosity, and I noticed that the same lunch produced 2 completely different curves depending on the day. Same food, same portion, same time. On the days when the curve stayed low and flat, I assumed I had slept better or been less stressed. It took me weeks of looking at the data before I found the actual variable, and it was almost stupid in its simplicity. On the flat days, I had been working at a desk with a footrest that let me bounce my heel without thinking about it. On the tall days, I had been sitting in a chair where my feet were flat and still. That was the entire difference. A habit I had never noticed, in the smallest muscle I own, was doing more to my blood sugar than anything else in my day. And I only found it because a sensor made it visible. That is not evidence. It is one person and a monitor. But it sent me into the literature, and the literature turned out to be far ahead of the advice. So the storage decision comes down to whether your leg is contracting while the trucks are on the road, which means the practical question is no longer whether this works. It is what exactly to contract, for how long, and when to start counting. Because getting the timing slightly wrong turns the whole thing into a leg bounce that does nothing. Here is the sole protocol. 3 components, each with an exact number, and 1 mistake at the end that cancels all 3 if you make it. The S stands for start the clock at the first bite, not the last. Your target is to have the contraction running within 30 minutes of beginning your meal, and to keep it running for a minimum of 45 minutes. 90 minutes is where the effect gets substantial. 2 hours covers most of the curve. The reason for 30 minutes is the shape of the storage window I walked you through. Glucose is already crossing into your blood before you finish eating. and insulin is climbing behind it. The triglycerides arrive later, but the insulin signal that closes the receiving dock at your muscle and opens the one at your fat tissue is already in place by the half-hour mark. Starting the contraction while the curve is still rising means the muscle is taking fuel out of circulation during the climb, which lowers the peak itself. Starting after the peak means you are cleaning up rather than preventing. Practically, this means the contraction belongs at the table and at the desk, not after. If you finish dinner and sit down on the couch, that is the moment. If you eat lunch at work and go back to your screen, that is the moment. You are already sitting for that hour. The protocol does not ask you to add an hour to your day. It asks you to change what one muscle is doing during an hour you were going to spend seated regardless. 45 minutes is the floor, because that is roughly where the local fuel uptake becomes meaningful rather than symbolic. Below that, you are doing a version of this that feels productive and moves very little. The O stands for 1 contraction per second, and this is the component where nearly everyone gets the mechanics wrong. Sit with your feet flat and your knees bent at about 90 degrees. Keep the ball of your foot and your toes planted on the floor and do not let them leave it. Raise only your heel as high as the joint comfortably allows, then lower it under control. Then again. Cadence is about 1 full raise and lower per second, which works out to somewhere between 50 and 80 repetitions per minute. Effort should sit at roughly 10 to 20% of what you could produce if you pushed. If your calf is burning, you are working far too hard and you will stop within 4 minutes, which defeats the entire purpose. The whole point is that this should be almost imperceptible. You should be able to hold a conversation, answer email, watch television, or sit through a meeting while it runs, and nobody should be able to tell you are doing anything. That is not a compromise. That is the design specification. A movement you can sustain for 90 minutes without noticing is worth more here than a movement that exhausts you in 6, because coverage of the window is what determines where the fat goes. For anyone over 50, this is also why the seated position matters. Standing calf raises load your body weight through the ankle and the Achilles tendon, which after 50 is a tissue with reduced elasticity and a genuine injury history in this age group. Seated, with the heel unweighted, there is essentially no load on the tendon and no joint stress anywhere. This is one of the very few interventions in metabolic health that carries almost no orthopedic cost. The L stands for lower the load the muscle has to clear, and it happens on the plate before the contraction ever starts. Your target is a minimum of 30 grams of protein and at least 10 grams of fiber eaten before the starch on the plate, and keeping refined starch and added sugar to roughly a quarter of the meal by volume rather than half. Eat the protein and the vegetables first. Eat the bread, rice, potato, or pasta last. The mechanism is the order of gastric emptying. Protein and fiber slow the rate at which the meal leaves your stomach, so glucose enters your bloodstream as a slope instead of a wall. Multiple controlled trials on meal sequencing, including work from Alpana Shukla and colleagues at Weill Cornell Medicine published in Diabetes Care and in BMJ Open Diabetes Research and Care, found that eating protein and vegetables before carbohydrate produced substantially lower blood glucose peaks and lower insulin responses from an identical meal. Identical food, different order. 30 grams of protein is not an arbitrary number either. Muscle protein synthesis becomes less responsive with age, a pattern researchers call anabolic resistance, and the work from Douglas Padden Jones at the University of Texas Medical Branch and from Stuart Phillips at McMaster University points to roughly 30 grams per meal as the threshold where the signal reliably registers after 50. So this component does 2 jobs at once. It flattens the curve your soleus has to clear today, and it protects the muscle mass that determines how well you clear curves in general 5 years from now. Those are the 3. Start within 30 minutes and hold for 45. 1 contraction per second at 10 to 20% effort. 30 grams of protein and 10 grams of fiber before the starch. Now the mistake, and this is the one that quietly invalidates everything. The mistake is bouncing from the hip instead of pivoting at the ankle. Watch anyone who fidgets in a chair. The knee goes up and down, the whole leg lifts, the heel stays roughly where it is relative to the foot, and the motion is driven by the hip flexor. That is not this. That movement barely touches the soleus, which is exactly the muscle you are trying to recruit, and it produces almost none of the metabolic effect. Millions of people bounce their legs all day and it changes nothing, which is precisely why the effect stayed hidden for so long. The distinction is the fixed forefoot. Your toes and the ball of your foot stay glued to the floor. The heel is the only part that travels. The pivot happens at the ankle, and the contraction happens in the deep calf. Underneath the muscle you can see. If you place your fingers on the back of your lower leg while you do it correctly, you will feel the tissue tighten low, near the ankle, rather than up in the visible bulge. That is the confirmation. The secondary version of the same mistake is intermittency. You start, you get absorbed in a task, you stop after 7 minutes without noticing, and you count the session as done. The uptake is proportional to time under contraction. So a stop and start pattern across 45 minutes might deliver 12 real minutes. The fix is structural, rather than a matter of remembering. Put a timer on your phone for the length of your window, or tie the contraction to something already running, like a program or a call, so the cue lives outside your attention. One necessary caution before the numbers become action. If you take insulin, a sulfonylurea, or any medication that lowers blood glucose directly, this protocol changes your post-meal glucose curve meaningfully, and that is a conversation to have with the physician who manages your dosing before you start, not after. A lower peak is the goal, but a lower peak on top of medication, calibrated to a higher peak, is a situation that needs supervision. The same applies to anyone with an existing Achilles or ankle injury, even seated. What you should expect from this, stated honestly, is not a number on a scale. Nobody can promise you a specific weight change from a contraction in your calf. What the mechanism produces is better clearance of glucose and fat from your blood during the hours you are actually storing, lower insulin demand from the same meals, and less of that circulating fat arriving at the depot with a private road into your liver. Those are the variables that visceral fat responds to, and they move on a timescale of months, not days. The satisfaction here is different from the usual one. You now understand a mechanism that most physicians were never taught, that the guideline system was structurally unable to measure, and that the fitness industry has no commercial reason to tell you about. The exact mechanism, from the enzyme on the vessel wall, to the fiber type in your calf, to the order of food on your plate. That is not motivation. That is biology, and you have it now. If you are going to run the Visceral protocol this week, comment the word soleus below so I can see who is actually doing it rather than filing it away. I read every comment, and if enough of you start, the next video is the layer underneath this one. Why the exact same meal eaten at 8 in the evening sends more fat to the abdominal depot than that meal eaten at noon, and what happens to that number after 50. It is the second half of the storage problem, and almost nobody connects the two. And please subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel grow and reach the people who need this. One video a week, mechanisms over motivation, every claim sourced.